The ships came in vast columns, miles wide and miles long. Thousands of them stretched from horizon to horizon. It was an armada the size of which the world had never before seen, one that carried hundreds of thousands of soldiers from at least 5 nations who would soon be thrust ashore on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. This was D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The landing craft surged and pitched in the heavy channel swells. Ahead lay the beaches with their forbidding rows of obstacles. Beyond loomed the bluffs, where concrete blockhouses studded the high ground and thick loops of barbed wire coiled around them in a menacing embrace. Behind the beach defenses, a powerful armored reserve waited to strike. As the troop-laden landing craft began the run toward the beaches, the men knew that they were unique in the annals of military conflict. True, they were invaders, but they came to liberate, not to conquer. This was their crusade, one that many who began the journey on this cold and wet spring morning would never complete. Here, in this moment of history, were the Allies in all their greatness. They had spent vast treasure and sacrificed thousands of their young men to learn the hard lessons of battle in preparation for this supreme moment. It had been a long road to D-Day, and it was a journey that had begun not with great success, but in terrible defeat. They moved with the slow, lurching gait of an army defeated. The limits of their endurance had long been passed, and now just putting one foot in front of the other became an act of sheer willpower. Behind them, in the wake of their retreat, lay the debris of a shattered army. This was France, 1940, the low point of Allied fortunes in World War II. 2 weeks into the German invasion of the West, the Allied battle plan lay in ruin, torn apart by marauding panzers, which seemed to appear on every flank to sow chaos, death, and panic.
When you look at the strategic problem of an invasion of France from both sides, you see that the French have constructed the Maginot Line, which effectively covers the majority of the German-French border. Then you have a sector of the area known as the Ardennes Forest, which is dense and impassable, difficult terrain. So difficult that the French and British planners dismiss it as a possible avenue of major attack. And so the only possibility in terms of the French and British strategic thinking is a movement through the Low Countries and Belgium into metropolitan France, a copy of what the Germans did in World War I. Well, Belgium's still neutral, so they don't have the option of moving forward and defend along the Belgian-German border. So what they do is they mass their best and most mobile units on the Franco-Belgian border in preparation for a movement in should the Germans invade Belgium. Of course, the Germans were pretty aware of what the Allied plans were, and they determined that they will strike through the Ardennes, through this impassable forest. Turns out not to be so impassable. There is a secondary German attack into Belgium. As planned, the Allies move forward. So when the Germans sweep in behind what is in effect the best part of the Allied armies, which are advancing into Belgium, it unhinges all the Allied plans and gives the Germans an edge that the Allies never recovered.
Now, with no hope of stopping the Wehrmacht, the French and British could only try to escape. For the British, that meant evacuation from the continent and getting what they could of the expeditionary force home. If the British Army could survive, so too could the Allied cause. One final effort brought the British to the port of Dunkirk.
I shall never forget my first views of the Dunkirk area. It was like a scrapyard. There were disabled vehicles lying on either side of the road with barely room for people to get through. And it must be borne in mind that all this time, and with all this movement we made, we were hampered by the refugee columns streaming away from the Germans.
As Allied forces fell back on Dunkirk, a defense perimeter was established around the city, but it was soon overrun by German panzers. The Allied forces at Dunkirk were about to be bagged, but on May 24th, help arrived from a most unexpected source.
At the end of May, Hitler actually orders the panzers to halt. And the reason for this was basically twofold. First, Göring convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe could prevent the evacuation of the British Army with air power alone. And then, with the British Army trapped at Dunkirk with no way out because their sea power had been destroyed by the Luftwaffe, then Hitler could dictate peace terms to the British.
The pause gave the Allies time to regroup, and when the German advance resumed, resistance had stiffened.
Two of us had stayed behind to blow up an obstacle, and as we were blowing it up, we could hear the German troops marching down the road. And my colleague and I hid in a ditch and covered ourselves up while these German soldiers marched past.
The Royal Navy hastily marshaled a fleet of destroyers, transports, channel ferries, and coastal steamers to rescue the survivors from the docks and beaches.
We got into the area of Dunkirk, dug into the sand dunes, and waited. About 2 days later, a couple of destroyers came inshore, and we joined the queue of men embarking on these destroyers.
The German Luftwaffe threw hundreds of aircraft against the evacuation fleet, and in spite of the heroic efforts of the Royal Air Force, 6 destroyers and over 200 other craft were lost.
Hardly had we set sail in the destroyer when it was hit, and all the forecastle of the destroyer was blown out. We were fortunately on the deck, and many men were wounded.
As the situation at Dunkirk grew increasingly desperate, a motley collection of yachts, fishing boats, and other craft braved German shelling and bombing to rescue British and French soldiers trapped against the coast. For over a week, the Allies endured the inferno of Dunkirk, and 69,000 men bought time with their lives as the evacuation continued. When the final boat turned for England at the beginning of June, it carried the last of the approximately 330,000 men lucky enough to escape. The men had survived, but England no longer possessed an army.
The army was successfully brought back to England, but it was disorganized, demoralized, and largely disarmed. All the tanks, all the artillery, and all the vehicles stayed behind in France.
The British were gone, forced off the continent of Europe in a humiliating defeat. Soon after, France surrendered, and what Winston Churchill called the long night of barbarism fell over Europe. Britain stood alone, determined to carry on despite all. That determination inspired the hope that someday, somehow, the Nazi hold on the continent would be broken. And within that hope, the seeds for D-Day were planted. Berlin. The soldiers of the Third Reich return home to a hero's welcome after their stunning conquest of France. Now, in the summer of 1940, only the English Channel stood between Germany and her greatest victory. Hitler had hoped that Britain, like France, would make peace. But when that did not occur, the Germans developed a plan for a cross-channel invasion. It was dubbed Operation Sea Lion, and envisioned a massive air campaign followed by an amphibious assault. Gaining air superiority over the Channel was critical to the plan. This would not only prevent RAF interference with the air and seaborne phases of the invasion, but more importantly, control of the Channel would be wrested from the Royal Navy. Once the skies and seas were secured, the invasion could proceed. And with the state of the British Army, there could only be one eventual outcome. The German Navy had already begun the difficult task of assembling the shipping necessary to transport, land, and supply the Army for the campaign, when in September it became clear that the invasion wasn't going to happen after all.
Because the Germans are not able to achieve air superiority over the Channel, they scrub their invasion plans. And at that point, the English Channel becomes a barrier not just to the Germans, but also to the British. The reason why the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority is twofold. First, they misemployed their air assets at the end of the summer and went after political targets instead of going after the Royal Air Force. And second, the incredible resolve and bravery of the Royal Air Force's fighter pilots, the few as they've become known, helped stop the onslaught.
The remarkable bravery of those young men taking on this massive German force. I mean, so many of them lost their young lives doing it. If it hadn't been for them, as I say, Hitler could so easily have just taken over Britain.
As both sides watched their enemy across the gray waters of the Channel, the action of the war moved to the periphery. At sea, the Germans attempted to strangle Britain with a U-boat campaign that nearly succeeded.
England was getting beaten up pretty badly with the submarine warfare. They were running out of supplies and food, and submarines were really winning it at that point.
I'd been working on the generators after my watch, and I laid down, and it just like somebody had picked that ship up about 10 feet off of a solid concrete foundation and dropped it. But by the time I got on my bunk, got to the door and looked aft, the stern of the ship was going underwater already. And when the ship went down, the submarine came up, and the guy spoke English, had a machine gun pointed down at our lifeboat. But he wanted to know if anybody was hurt, if there's any officers. Of course, no officers on board. But if anybody was hurt, if we had food and water, know which way to go towards land, and good luck, and he left.
Britain's plight alarmed many Americans, yet most were reluctant to repeat the experience of World War I.
I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglement. Let Europe fight her own battle. Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
In the past, we have built with a Europe dominated by England and France. In the future, we may have to deal with a Europe dominated by Germany.
And it was precisely that possibility which President Roosevelt most feared. In spite of public opposition, FDR began cautious but deliberate steps to provide assistance to Great Britain. And in so doing, he gave America time to prepare.
The beginning of the American rearmament program is accelerated dramatically at this point, and many steps are taken to increase the manpower and the equipment available to the American armed forces. Something needs to be done right away, however. So as a way of forestalling or helping the British at this point, President Roosevelt offers to trade them 50 old destroyers from the World War I era for base rights in the Caribbean and places like that. And so that deal is made as a way to help Britain in a way that is not unacceptable to the American public.
In January of 1941, British and U.S. officers met secretly in Washington, D.C. to map out a joint strategy should America be drawn into the war. The meeting established a unified command structure and, more importantly, called for a priority being given to the defeat of Germany, even if America went to war with Japan.
In the 1930s, Japan had conducted a series of aggressive moves into China, first seizing Manchuria, then the coastal ports and large amounts of Chinese territory. The United States and Britain had not responded very strongly to this until, taking advantage of the fall of France, Japan moved into French Indochina in 1940. This directly threatened the British at Singapore and the Americans in the Philippines. The President of the United States issued an ultimatum demanding a Japanese withdrawal and threatening a tough embargo, cutting off oil and scrap metal to Japan, virtually guaranteeing that Japan would go to war.
In March of 1941, FDR signed the Lend-Lease Act into law, which allowed America to provide goods and services without immediate payment to nations whose defense the President considered vital to the defense of the United States.
People of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, This is an emergency as serious as war itself.
In August, a historic meeting took place between Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt. Known as the Atlantic Conference, it cemented a personal relationship between the two leaders and led to an announcement that together Britain and the United States would preserve world freedom and improve world conditions after the war. Of more immediate importance was FDR's announcement that American warships would begin escorting all Atlantic convoys west of Iceland.
The U-boats was doing so much damage, Roosevelt sent a bunch of the destroyers around there. And so my brother was on one of the tin cans. He was in the war before the war started.
United Press assigned me to become a war correspondent attached to the Navy. And almost immediately shipped out on my first convoy to England when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its height.
In October, the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk with the loss of 115 lives. Despite pressure from Churchill, who desperately wanted America in the war, FDR did nothing. For now, Britain would have to stand alone. By 1941, Britain had fully mobilized its population. 94% of males between the ages of 14 and 64 were in either the military or war industries.
We were all very much indoctrinated into serving our country. Then the war came along, and Dad joined the Army within a week because he was in the First World War. And my two older brothers, who had been in the Navy, had transferred to the British Merchant Marine, and I lost them both.
My father was too old to be in active service, but he was in the Home Guard. But of course, a lot of it were older men, like my dad, and I think their arms were certainly very inadequate. I mean, there wasn't much in the way of weapons for them. But they would meet and march and, I don't know, do things that soldiers do.
I think the thought basically was, well, we've got to get on with what we've got, but we haven't got enough.
It was a remarkable effort, but the fact remained the British Empire did not possess the strength to tackle the Germans head-on. They could, however, strike back through the air, an idea that appealed to Churchill.
The British really didn't have much choice. They got thrown off the continent in 1940. They're not going to be back on the continent until 1944. What are they supposed to do in between? And so almost by default, the British had to try strategic bombing.
They came at night, British bombers flying individually to their target areas. Bombing by the light of the moon with primitive navigation, they used major German cities as targets. It was a war in the shadows, one where technology and the latest electronic gizmos would swing the balance of power to and fro. And in 1941, the Germans held the upper hand.
The German defenses were very good. Whenever we had a trip over Germany, Essen, Cologne, Dusseldorf, Hamburg, Mannheim, any of those, I got hold of every trip from flak. And then later on, and near the end of my tour, when they got the fighters, they were very good.
The losses suffered over the Reich were staggering, draining Britain of some of her finest men while putting an ever-increasing strain on her war effort.
If Churchill had hoped for a quick and easy victory with the Royal Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Germany, he was destined to be disappointed. By 1941-1942, the Royal Air Force was sustaining terrible losses in those battles in darkness over German cities. And the Germans endured it. They were able to absorb the damage that the RAF was inflicting on them and continue their war effort and expand their war effort. Well, the British persisted, and the Royal Air Force continued their strategic bombing campaign in hopes that this campaign would avoid the necessity of an invasion of the European continent.
The British were unable to conduct cross-channel military operations after Dunkirk on any scale, but they wanted to keep the Germans off balance and looked around for ways to continue the war. One idea that was followed up was to set up some special units called commandos of highly trained troops who were sent on raids against the German-held coast from Norway down to France. These were very effective at gathering intelligence, prisoners, and raising morale at home with little successes to brag about. They sufficiently upset